The Outer Worlds is great, and it's just what weary Fallout fans need right now. In order to understand why this game matters so much to Fallout and RPG fans, we need to go all the way back to the beginning, because the truth is, the game was rigged from the start. In 1997, Black Isle Studios, a studio working on the parent company Interplay, released Fallout. It was a spiritual successor to Wasteland, a game set in a similar universe that had released in 1988 by Interplay Productions before they'd become a publishing arm. The original Wasteland was published by EA. Yes, that same Wasteland that now has a sequel and will soon have a third game, that same Interplay that sold Fallout to Bethesda years later, and that same EA we all love to hate. Fallout became a critical and commercial success, and Black Isle went on to develop a direct sequel a year later in Fallout 2. Because if it ain't broke, don't come out with a confusing name or game, I guess. Fallout 2 would go on to be an even bigger success than its predecessor, by simply not changing what wasn't broken. Just expanding on what was already built allowed them to make a bigger, better world with more characters, quests and lore than one had, and only a year later. Black Isle took a break from Fallout and went on to create games like PlanetSide Torment, the Icewind Dale series and Baldur's Gate Dark Alliance 2. They even began working on a third Fallout project codenamed Van Buren, but before that could come close to completion, Interplay Entertainment filed for bankruptcy and promptly shuttered Black Isle. The license for Fallout was sold to Bethesda Softworks in a minimum advance against royalties deal worth $1.175 million. Bethesda threw away the Van Buren project and started from scratch with the plan to throw the Fallout universe into the Gamebryo engine they had used for the Elder Scrolls series, the most recent being the Elder Scrolls IV Oblivion. Despite fan fears that a brand new team with no previous Fallout developers were now working on the next game in the series, Fallout 3 released in 2007, and it did pretty good. Fallout was already successful and beloved by fans before Fallout 3, but it's difficult to put into words just how much of an impact Bethesda's iteration had on the franchise. Fallout had only had 2 mainstream games 10 years earlier and 2 spin-off games since. It had a very cult niche following, but following 3 it suddenly exploded into mainstream pop culture. It's practically impossible to walk into a store or browse online for anything video game related without seeing a plethora of Nuka-Cola and Vault inspired merch. Shocking as it is, this wasn't the case in 2007. Fallout went from being a niche but loved PC series from the 90s to one of the biggest franchises in the world, practically overnight. It's important Bethesda are given their due for not only resuscitating what could be argued as a potentially dead franchise, but allowing it to flourish. For better or worse, everyone knew what Fallout was now, and Bethesda had turned Fallout into a money-making machine while seemingly keeping its soul intact. It was clear to Bethesda they had something that could rival even their Elder Scrolls series, and it was clear to them the wise thing to do would be to keep hold of it. In 2007, just under a year before the release of Fallout 3, Bethesda outright bought the IP from Interplay for approximately $5.75 million. It's clear Bethesda were pretty confident Fallout 3 would be a hit during its development, and so it was. After Fallout 3 made tons and tons of money, Bethesda were keen to start working on another game, as you would be. Fallout 3 sold over 600,000 units in its first initial month of release. To put that into perspective, the Elder Scrolls IV Oblivion, Bethesda's previous game, had only sold 500,000 units in its first month. A series that hadn't had a mainstream game for 10 years and was being developed by a completely different team had sold more than an Elder Scrolls game that had 3 previous titles before it. Bethesda had a new goldmine, a secondary IP that could work alongside the Elder Scrolls series and not rival it. Because whilst they're very similar in terms of gameplay, the settings are so different that people can enjoy one and dislike the other. Bethesda, as you could expect, were keen to start working on another game in the series to capitalise on its success. However, the devs were busy working on the next Elder Scrolls game at the time and couldn't dedicate the effort and resources to creating a new Fallout title. That game would go on to do pretty well too. Bethesda didn't want to let the newfound success in Fallout stagnate, so they reached out to a studio called Obsidian Entertainment, a studio that had been founded after the closure of Black Isle by former employees including Fergus Urquhart, the director of the original Fallout, and Chris Avellone, one of the directors of Fallout 2. Obsidian had gained a reputation for developing RPGs similar to what they had done at Black Isle. This included games like Knights of the Old Republic 2 and Neverwinter Nights 2, and it gained an early reputation for critically solid titles. These games showed a signature depth that the RPGs at Black Isle had been characterised by. Games that were generally known for their incredible writing, player choice, and progression. Bethesda struck a deal with Obsidian, in which they would pay them a one-off fee to develop a Fallout title with a bonus if the game's average Metacritic rating topped 85. It would go on to sit at 84. This deal, while seeming very much in favour of Bethesda, made sense for all parties involved. Bethesda could continue to capitalise on their new juggernaut, and the devs at Obsidian, who was still a relatively new independent studio, could go back to a series they had created and loved. Obsidian pitched a game that went back to its West Coast roots, and was set between the events of Fallout 2 and 3. Bethesda were happy for the game to be set on the West Coast, but rejected the idea of it being set between 2 and 3. The game was announced in April 2009 under the title Fallout New Vegas. It took heavy inspiration from the developer's previous Van Buren project, including factions such as Caesar's Legion that had been planned to be included in their own take on Fallout 3. The game would be made using the same Gamebryo engine Bethesda had used for 3, keeping the open 3D world and predominantly first-person perspective. New Vegas took only around 18 months to develop and broke the record for the amount of dialogue lines in a single-player action game with around 65,000, beating the previous folder, Fallout 3, by around 25,000. New Vegas focused more on what the original games had pioneered, freedom to approach any number of situations any number of ways. The game used the same special system for building a character as 3, but where many felt it differed is its multiple approaches to quests, the world, and how it was shaped. A player could talk their way out of a gunfight if their speech was high enough, or use their knowledge of science or engineering to open a door and avoid an area or solve a crisis threatening to boil over. All of these meant the game had many quests that could end in several different ways, depending on how the player chose to approach them, and the world would adapt accordingly. It's these aspects that have made New Vegas a fan favourite of the new wave of Fallout games, with Obsidian seemingly giving the player a more in-depth RPG experience, and people were beginning to notice and split into 2 camps. While Bethesda had revived Fallout and created a huge and accessible hit with Fallout 3, New Vegas catered more to RPG fans and fans of the original. Many people who had been introduced to Fallout by 3, myself included, saw how much more freedom could be introduced into Fallout with New Vegas. The future of Fallout, for all intents and purposes, looked bright. Bethesda had a money-making merch machine in their palms, and Obsidian had been able to take a successful crack at an IP they had so lovingly made in the 90s. It seemed more collaborations in games would begin to follow, but, perhaps strangely, Fallout would lay dormant again for another 5 years. Bethesda announced Fallout 4 through a live stream in February 2015. The game would take place in a post-apocalyptic Boston, taking the series away from the West Coast that Obsidian had pioneered and back to Bethesda's favoured East Coast. The game would also use the Creation Engine, Bethesda's own take on the Gamebryo engine used previously. Bethesda had used the Creation Engine on Skyrim, and while it was still buggy as hell, it was a graphical improvement over the aging Gamebryo engine, albeit still only slightly. Fans got excited. The Bethesda hype train pushed on with promises of more info at E3 of that year, and people went a bit mad. If one thing was certain, it was that the 5-year hiatus and release of New Vegas in 2010 had only whetted appetites for a new game. This was only exacerbated when at E3 that year, Bethesda took to the stage and showed off a new build mechanic, promising players they could rebuild the wasteland. Players could now create bases in the game world, where NPCs could populate, and to top it all off, the game would release in less than 5 months, on the 10th of November. Fallout fans went crazy, Bethesda took a bow, and everyone was happy. It seemed Bethesda had done it again, and Fallout 4 was set to be the biggest game in the franchise's history, and perhaps even Bethesda's. Fallout 4 was released to largely critical acclaim. The game takes place in Boston roughly 10 years after the events of Fallout 3 in Washington DC. Fans loved the new base building system, even if the Creation Engine regularly buckled under it, and its massive open world. However, the new speech mechanic was widely derided. No longer was there many options of dialogue and approaches to quests, but now the player was given only 4 options to respond to NPCs, each one simply showing you 1 or 2 words of the basic response of your character. The prompt might say sarcastic, and your character will proceed with a thinly veiled sarcastic response. You wouldn't actually see the line that your character was going to speak, you just had to press some kind of neutral or positive response and then watch them say it. On top of this, for the first time the Fallout series had a fully voiced protagonist, something many fans felt the game didn't need. Many fans felt Bethesda had sacrificed a huge amount of the depth just to put a voiced protagonist in the game. Still, many could see past this with the improvements to graphics, gunplay, and the glorious world Bethesda had created. The game was another huge success, generating $750 million in its first 24 hours of launch. Not bad for a license bought only 8 years prior for less than $6 million. The game was followed with 6 batches of DLC, of which players could purchase a season pass originally for $29.99. However, the price of the pass would be increased only 4 months later, as Bethesda said they had increased their plans to make DLC for the game, seemingly in response to its success. The DLC that followed over the next year received mixed reviews, some of it hitting the mark and others not so much. Despite a few murmurs of discontent with the speech issue, some DLC problems, and the usual plethora of Bethesda bugs, the majority of fans were relatively happy, and Bethesda was making a killing on their IP again. Bethesda had taken a gamble almost a decade earlier on an IP few had heard of, and fewer thought could be revived. The gamble had paid off. In 2016, Bethesda was riding high on the goodwill of its fanbase and the sales of its hit titles. Bethesda had developed from a small developer 10 years earlier to one of the major players in the video game marketplace, thanks to its Elder Scrolls series, a bunch of cleverly acquired dormant IPs including Doom and Wolfenstein, a plethora of original titles, and of course its wildly popular Fallout series. There was just one problem. Bethesda games were largely single-player experiences. Once a player had played them, there was little reason to go back. Many developers and publishers at that time had transitioned many of their games to a games-as-a-service model. This essentially meant their titles would have controversial additions such as microtransactions in-game and online connectivity as standard. The main idea behind this was that a developer could create a game and then work on that game for years and years to come, with players continuously playing online and buying microtransactions to cover the cost of development. This meant a game didn't need to rely on its sales alone. It could be continuously developed and pull a profit by releasing seasons and DLCs and microtransactions as time went on. Despite a lot of negative reaction to these from many, the industry seemed to be heading that way. Games were incredibly expensive to make thanks to the graphics wars of consoles and PCs and the progress of technology. It was clear that despite some negative reaction, these games-as-a-service models could allow a game to support itself and create a lasting revenue stream long after the initial purchase of the game. This was also a way to circumnavigate second-hand sales, of which developers and publishers did not see a penny for. Many series had created a financial tail long after their release and still do to this day. Games like Overwatch, League of Legends, Destiny, Rainbow Six Siege, and many more make money years after their release, and were increasingly a much more attractive prospect for publishers and devs to create. Of course, there are issues to this model. If a game doesn't sell well or gets a large enough player base, developers can find themselves stuck developing a game that isn't making a profit. If a developer pulls the plug on a game, people who've spent money and bought into that game after the initial purchase can feel hard done by and cheated. This makes PR relations with fans difficult, and in many cases games have completely died on community reaction to how their model's been set up. Publishers also have to spend money on maintaining that game, and in many cases they have to decide when to pull the plug on the support for their fans. For how long and for how much money do you support a game after the initial release and hype has died down? How many years do you support that game when there's a dwindling player base? How much do you value the individual over the vast amounts of players playing it? These are prickly questions for any business, and by developers creating these games as service models, they open themselves up to criticism for the development of these. Bethesda, however, had ridden high on its goodwill with fans and was largely seen by many as a defender of traditional single-player games. Yes, these games had DLCs, but most were reasonably priced and packed with content. The flip side to this was once a Bethesda game released, it generally tailed off for the company quite quickly. Second-hand copies of Bethesda titles were going for tiny sums and could be seen everywhere. It seemed only a matter of time before something changed. Just before the release of Fallout 4, Bethesda had toyed with this idea by releasing the Elder Scrolls Online, at the time a subscription-based service game that was online in the Elder Scrolls universe. That game has had its ups and downs since 2015, but generally is seen as quite a success story for Bethesda. Many were predicting some kind of online capability for the next Fallout game, but many were also cautious of this. Fallout had built a reputation as a single solitary game. You are alone in a post-apocalyptic world. You are a lone wanderer, as it were. On May 29, 2018, Bethesda began streaming the now iconic Fallout test pattern screen. The message of "Please stand by" had been used before for the announcement of Fallout 4, and fans quickly flocked to watch a bobblehead figure sit idly in front of a looping screen. Over 2 million people would tune in over 24 hours, and the viewer count never dropped below 100,000. Rumours were rife about what Bethesda had in store, as very few people had expected a Fallout title only a few years after 4, and no leaks at all had hinted at a Fallout game in the works, something very difficult to achieve in today's climate. A remastered version of Fallout 3 was high on the list of expectations, as it was the 10th anniversary of the game at the time. Finally, after 24 hours of frenzied hype, the trailer for Fallout 76 was shown with promises of more to show at E3. Bethesda took to the stage at E3 2018 and focused heavily on the title. Like 4, it would release only 5 months later on November 14th and would be an always online multiplayer only experience. The game would take place in West Virginia and would be set much earlier in the timeline compared to other Fallout games, being only 25 years after the bombs fell in the fictional universe and wiped out much of civilization. The tagline "Our future begins" hinted at the idea behind the game. You, with the help of your fellow survivors from Vault 76, would rebuild the land after the devastation. The game showed a much greener, less radiated setting, and introduced a camp system in which players could build using the same system as in Fallout 4, but could do so almost anywhere on the map, and move their base on the fly for a small in-game fee. Fans showed a mix of optimism and caution for the game. Many were upset that the Fallout universe would be always online and a multiplayer experience, whilst many were just happy they could now share the Fallout universe with their friends. Others feared the soul of the game would be torn out, as Fallout generally relied on a solitary atmospheric approach, and the inclusion of numerous other online players would destroy this. Bethesda moved quickly to try to ease these concerns, stating the game would have a story the player could follow entirely alone if they wished, and that each world would only be populated with a couple dozen or so players. Todd Howard also promised a world 4 times the size than that of Fallout 4, meaning players could actively avoid other players if they wanted to. However, players would be able to see each other on the map, join in parties and fast travel to locations close to them. Many fans, however, understood the need for Fallout to evolve and saw this as a potential necessary evil to help with Fallout's future development. The creation engine would again be used, but was modified to accommodate online play. Fans geared themselves to what would be a special Fallout game, whether special in a positive or negative way remained to be seen. On October 23rd, 2018, Fallout 76 opened its first public beta. Fan reaction was mixed. Many enjoyed the interaction with other players and felt the game had potential. However, almost all reported numerous bugs and glitches, and even Bethesda pre-warned of what it called spectacular issues that players may experience in the beta. This was all nothing new to Fallout fans. Bethesda's open world games had been notorious for bugs and glitches from the start, with many seeing them as part of the DNA of what makes a Bethesda game so special. So long as they weren't too numerous or game-breaking, most fans were fine with the odd enemy spinning off into the ether. Besides, given this was an upgraded version of the creation engine, they hoped the issues wouldn't be as numerous as past Fallout games. However, once the full game released, it became quickly clear they were wrong. I went over my initial thoughts on Fallout 76 in my original video last year. If you want an in-depth look at my thoughts at the time, have a watch. However, my conclusion was that whilst it didn't ruin Fallout for me, it certainly damaged my love of the series. This seemed to be the general thought of many fans as well. For a franchise that runs on hyper fan love, this can be very damaging in the long run. Fallout relied on excitement for each title. It relies on fans who see it as a unique experience and will in return buy tons of merchandise and every bit of DLC Bethesda puts out. Within weeks of the game being released, it was now being torn apart by those same fans. On an almost daily basis, the game was being criticised in a new way. All the controversies and issues would take me an entire video on its own just to go through, so let's just highlight some key ones. The game was broken, more broken than any Fallout game before. Almost every player reported issues of textures not appearing, players and enemies getting stuck, rubber banding, nuke codes simply not working, the game straight up losing saved data, player camps not spawning and blueprints going missing. This happened to me on numerous occasions, and I know it happened to my friends. The game's microtransactions were worse than anyone had imagined. In less than a month, by December, the Atom Shop, as it was called, was receiving heavy criticism. One particular item seemed to sum up feelings. A Santa Claus outfit and a large sign cost $20 and $14 of in-game currency to buy. This was more than the entire season pass for all the DLC of Fallout 4 combined. Well, before they upped the price anyway. In spring 2019, the game introduced items into the shop that improved the player's inventory and weapon management. These issues have been something many fans have complained about since launch. The game only allowed you to store a limited amount of items and junk used for building, and giving players only limited options to sell it for in-game currency. Now, for the small price of real-world money, you could fix that, and your weapons immediately with repair kits, also on sale. but those of us who had only paid for the game originally could not. This is what many in the industry call pay to win, as it means a player willing to pay money on top of their original purchase gains a considerable advantage in-game over a player who does not. This is something Pete Hines, marketing executive for Bethesda, had less than a year earlier said would not happen when he said all microtransactions would be cosmetic. The game also received very poor reviews from both professional media outlets and fans, with many saying the lack of NPCs and any real plot made the game dull, and it didn't have that Fallout magic. Currently, as I make this video, the game stands at 52% rating on PC, 53% for PS4, and a lowly 49% for Xbox One on Metacritic. This made it by far the lowest rated AAA game of that year, and even a year later, that has not improved. This is made even worse by the fact Fallout 4 has an 84% rating for PC, 3 has a 91% rating, and New Vegas an 84% rating. Somehow, Bethesda had made the game even buggier than before, and in the last year, subsequent updates have done little to improve it. Outside of the game itself, there were also problems. Bethesda had marketed and released what they called a Power Armor version of the game. The version included the game and a bunch of collector's items, including what Bethesda originally described as a canvas bag. When the additions were delivered, the bags were not canvas, but nylon. Players complained. Bethesda promptly sent curt replies to customers saying the bag materials had to be changed due to canvas being too expensive, and the bags would not be replaced. They also changed the advertisement on the website after the controversy from canvas to nylon after the fact. This was made worse given that many YouTubers and influencers had been given a completely different bag by Bethesda made of canvas before the game's release. Bethesda changed tact soon after and offered players 500 atoms, the game's version of store currency, to players. This equated to $5 US. Many fans ironically and hilariously pointed out this wasn't even enough to buy a postman outfit in the game, of which gave the player an in-game canvas bag as part of the outfit. After this, Bethesda once again changed tact and told people who ordered the Power Armor edition of the game they would produce the canvas bag, but they would only ship within 4 to 6 months. Also, these would not be sent to customers automatically. Customers had to fill in a form with their details to receive the bag. To make matters worse, a data breach allowed users to open and close other customers' tickets as well as edit them, prompting Bethesda to close their entire site down to fix the problem. This wasn't the only issue with promotional pre-orders of Fallout-related merch, however. Bethesda had partnered with the Silver Screen Bottling Company to make a tie-in dark rum called Nuka Dark Rum. An absolutely fantastic name, I'm sure you'll agree. The promotional material appeared to show a frosty glass bottle of dark rum. The orders were due to be shipped out on November 14th when the game released, but were delayed by the company and eventually shipped in late December. Fans were further irritated when the bottle arrived, and it was a normal glass bottle with a plastic shell surrounding it. Not many had expected that. These plastic bottles had cost $80, by the way. The company even said that it cost them more to make a plastic shell to surround a glass bottle than it would have done to make a frosted glass bottle. So why didn't you just make the frosted glass bottle then? And finally, in September 2019, 20,000 Nuka-Cola themed helmets produced by Chronicle Collectibles were recalled by the US Product Consumer Safety Commission. Phew, that's difficult to say. Due to containing high levels of mold. Yes, mold. Pretty grim. Bethesda has tried to stabilise Fallout 76's vitals in its first year of release. At E3 they announced NPCs would be coming to the game in what they dubbed the Wastelander update, and stated it would release towards the end of 2019. In October, that date was pushed back to spring 2020. Then came the icing on the very messy, out-of-date cake. Just 6 days after announcing the free Wastelanders update was being delayed by months, Bethesda announced an optional subscription service for 76 called Fallout First. The subscription costs £11 99 pence a month, or, deep breath, £99.99 a year. £100. With this you get access to private worlds, something fans have been asking for since day one, unlimited storage for crafting items, which I mentioned before, fans have been asking for since day one, a survival tent that allows you to quickly place a fast travel marker with your items there and ready, 650 atoms per month, new icons and emotes, and as if to simply take the absolute pissery, the Ranger outfit from Fallout New Vegas. Needless to say, fan reaction hasn't been great. Just Google it. I've done enough on this game and the terrible, awful, really not very good year Bethesda has had with it. At the Game Awards in December 2018, Obsidian Entertainment announced a new RPG called The Outer Worlds. The game was a first-person action RPG that drew heavily from Obsidian's previous RPG mechanics and in particular Fallout New Vegas. The game was a brand new IP and set in a fictional future where humans have left Earth and formed colonies. You would play within one of these colonies and be able to explore several planets. The game differed in that it was not one massive open world, but several smaller ones across different landscapes. The game released on October 25th, 2019, almost a year to the day since Fallout 76's open beta went live. The game has received universal acclaim and currently sits at 86% for the PS4 version on Metacritic. And here's where I deviate from my history-telling tones and my spiteful 76 ones. I've played this game and finished it. I've done practically every side quest there is to, and I still feel I could play through it all again and experience something completely different. This game is fantastic, and it's a brilliant tonic for weary Fallout fans who feel one of their favourite worlds has been tarnished by 76. It's similar enough to show how much better Obsidian are at certain things, and different enough to be its own thing. The world is just as dark and just as funny, but in a completely different way to Fallout, with more humour and bright colourful worlds to explore, despite the overarching lore being ironically as over the top and as grim as the Fallout world. The ability to build a character however you wish, whether it be combat heavy, great at talking their way out of situations, hacking and lockpicking their way around problems, or just intelligent enough to solve problems that could otherwise have ended in violence, makes the world infinitely replayable. The world changes drastically depending on decisions you make, and even those you can't make if you aren't good enough in a certain field. There's no microtransactions, at least not yet, and the game is even on Xbox Game Pass since Microsoft purchased Obsidian during development. Above all, however, the game doesn't just work, but it's a joy to play. I came across one bug. I got stuck in a rock. One bug in a game similar in scope, size and mechanics to Fallout is embarrassing for Bethesda. The fact that the same indie studio who not even 10 years ago were grasping at the chance given to them by Bethesda to make a Fallout game again are now releasing a game infinitely more playable than Bethesda's own Fallout juggernaut is insane, and an absolute testament to Obsidian and how much effort and work they have put into the Outer Worlds. From humble beginnings to becoming a titanic juggernaut arrogantly thought too big to fail by those who made their fortunes of it, Fallout is buckling under its own weight of expectation and mismanagement. The Outer Worlds could not have timed its arrival any better, and from the Outer Worlds' humble beginnings, maybe Fallout and Bethesda's cash cow could meet its end. Ideally, these two amazing worlds that have captured so many people's imaginations can carry on doing so in harmony. Right now, however, as the tides change, Fallout is crashing into rocks, while the Outer Worlds surfs the crest of a new wave.
As long as we provide our own cradles.